Hello and welcome to this new segment that I would like to call Bible Bullshit 101. And yes, we're doing it all at this angle. Okay, so the thing that we're going to take a look at today in the Bible, the stupid shit that's in the Bible, is Matthew chapter 4, verse 8. It's the scene where Jesus is shown, or where Satan leads Jesus into the desert, and then he shows him all the kingdoms of the world and so on. Well, first off, it's a very interesting sign of just how ineptly the Bible is actually written and compiled, because we have the same scene again in Luke. We have the same scene again in another gospel, which of course right there just shows the quality and caliber of whoever compiled this. Okay, yeah, granted, there is Mark in between, but if you were to take them in chronological order, you'd first have Mark, then Matthew, then Luke, and then at the very last one that was written was John, which is, by the way, the gospel, of course, that takes the most liberties with the whole Jesus thing. And yes, so this is the scene where Satan shows Jesus all the kingdoms of the world and says, you know, you can have all of that stuff if you just bow down before me and accept me as your new master. Now, there are two ways that you can actually see this scene. The first one is of course the way that most rationalists do. That this scene, or that the entirety of the Bible is just a product of its time, in the same way that Machiavelli's Il Principe is, in the same way that Karl Marx's Kapital is, in the same way that, say, the Götz of Belching of Goethe is. It's just a product of its time, and the people who wrote it, that's the one way you can see it. The other way is, of course, through the eyes of a biblical literalist, which means that every single part of this chapter, of this verse, literally really happened. There was an actual person like, you know, Jesus, who did all those miracles, and there is this actual evil demonic thing that grabs onto people and makes them do evil things, and that scene actually really happened. And it doesn't really matter from what angle you take this story, you're gonna get fucked up either way. But let's just take a look at let's just explore the first kind of way that you can view the story. The first thing, cut. Okay, so Satan shows Jesus all the realms of the world, but of course if you take this into perspective of, you know, it's a product of its time, I mean, what did people from the Middle East really know about the world? What did the Romans actually know about the world outside of their empire? I mean, if you take a look at the Mediterranean, or let's say the 1,000-mile radius from the outskirts of the Roman Empire, the borders of the Roman Empire, what is there really in terms of kingdoms, of great riches, of splendid cities, like huge booming metropolises metropolis. There really isn't anything, is there? I mean, to the north you have Hibernia, which is modern-day Ireland, and you have Caledonia, but although they are Celtic and do kind of have like a king thing going on, there isn't really anything that speaks big about this culture, about this kind of, about these people. They're pretty much just living in mud huts. The same thing goes for Germania to the east, or the northeast of the Roman Empire. There's nothing, there's really nothing at all there that could even be remotely considered high culture. I mean, at best, the only two like rich kingdoms, like immensely rich and insanely rich kingdoms, the Romans or someone from, let's say, the Middle East or the Mediterranean in general could have really known about were Persia, which is in modern-day Iran, and India. China, maybe. But then again, the only thing that most Romans probably knew about China were porcelain and silk that somehow made their way to Rome. So they didn't really know about China also, or either. And the only other possibility would be in like sub-Saharan Africa, like the Egyptians during, I can't remember, Hatshepsut's reign. She started an expedition to what they called Punt, which is apparently, or was apparently, this insanely rich African kingdom in what they called Nubia, which is now geography. Sudan, like Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, that kind of region above the Horn, like between Egypt and the Horn of Africa, that sort of region. Apparently there was some insanely wealthy African kingdom, but yeah, apart from that, not really all that much that Satan could have offered Jesus, really. I mean, it really only comes down to Persia and India. So on that aspect, seeing it through the eyes of the people who wrote it, even there that story fails. And now we get to the second way that one could see this story. It already hurts. It's through the eyes of the biblical literalist, who really believes that every fucking word in this verse is literal. Meaning that when it says, Satan showed Jesus all the kingdoms of the world in the blink of an eye, we're not just talking about the world in the sense of the world that was known to people from the Middle East or people living within the Roman Empire. We're actually talking about world as in the entire globe. And this is where this entire thing falls apart. Because if we make the assumption that world, in this case, means globe, the entirety of the globe, all the world, the entire continents, everything that was around in terms of empires and rich countries at the time supposed for Jesus. We're talking about China, Han Dynasty. We're talking about any, as I've already said, wealthy, insanely rich sub-Saharan African kingdom, because, surprise, surprise, they did actually exist before let's say, Mansa Musa, for example, there were already very powerful and very rich African kingdoms at the time supposed for Christ. But now is where we get into the insanely stupid stuff. If we make the assumption that world means globe, that means that Satan showed Jesus, of course, the kingdoms of the American continent. Specifically, Teotihuacan and El Mirador, which was the largest Mayan city at that time. And before I go on to explain the bullshit, I know this is YouTube. I know what the comments are going to be like, so I'm just going to put this out there. There's some scientists in the field that study pre-classic Mayan culture, or Mayan culture in general, assume the decline for El Mirador at about 50 AD. That's when things already or started to go downhill. However, in Maya, God Kings in the Rainforest, which was co-authored by Nikolai Grube, one of the biggest experts on Mayan culture and Mayan history out there, it says that the heyday of El Mirador was between 150 BC and 150 AD, putting the absolute pinnacle of this heyday at the time supposed for Christ. Now, I don't know which date is actually correct. If you know anything more about it, in the comments below, would be very interesting to get an actual time frame for this, so that I also know what the hell is going on, because no one tells me anything. But getting back to the actual verse, and the reason why I wanted to talk about this, is that, yes, if we make the assumption that that is literal, then Satan actually did show Jesus El Mirador with its huge, gigantic Ladanta complex. And a funny thing is, yesterday, or the day before yesterday, I actually did make a kind of meme out of this, something along the lines of, like, Jesus gets shown the entire world, but it gets shown Ladanta and El Mirador, but for some reason never mentions this or has any questions about it. And I posted this to the Thinking Atheist fan Facebook page, and I'm just going to show it to you right here. This is the picture. So yeah, that's basically the main problem with this whole thing. And remember, we're talking about El Mirador here. We're talking about the Ladanta complex. This thing is massive. We're talking about a huge, gigantic pyramid. And, again, I know the comments. I know you people. Let me be clear here. Some estimate, like the original plaque, the actual plaque at the site in Guatemala, says the pyramid is 72 meters tall. Tall. Some sources, however, say it's 172 meters tall. The only thing that I can figure is that the 172 are the result if you add pyramid and understructure together, and that somehow you get 172 meters in total height. Yeah, so before anyone out there in the comments goes apeshit, there are two numbers posed for the height of this thing. But still, this thing is fucking massive. You have this huge understructure. This thing is 600 long and 300 meters wide. That's about half as big as the Vatican. The biggest temple in the entirety of the Roman Empire was the Jewish temple. And to be honest, when compared to the Ledanta complex or its smaller twin, the El Tigre complex, which is also in El Mirador, yeah, it looks like a fucking mud hut. There is no comparison to El Mirador anywhere else. Maybe in China that they built a structure that was equally impressive at the same time. Sun Pyramid in Teotihuacan, again, I'm not sure about this, but I believe that at the time supposed for Jesus, the Sun Pyramid was just in its infancy. Either it wasn't even being built yet, or they just started building this. Again, estimates say that the Sun Pyramid was finished around 200 AD. So yeah, you can maybe imagine that building started at that point. So yeah, around that time, El Mirador's Ledanta was this massive, gigantic, huge pyramid that is really, there is no comparison to this thing. And I don't know about you, but if I was Jesus being shown this gigantic city, which some scientists estimate to have at least 80,000, if not 100,000 people living in it, if someone showed me this, I would have some serious questions. For one, holy shit, there's something beyond Hispania, which is the Roman name for the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal. That was called Hispania. Second of all, holy shit, there are other cultures out there. Third of all, holy fucking shit, what the hell did they build there? What the fuck is this huge, gigantic pyramid? And thirdly, holy shit, why didn't anyone tell me about this? Why didn't God ever tell me about this? I mean, it's literally the equivalent of someone like you or me basically being shown an entirely different planet. Being shown this entirely different planet somewhere beyond our solar system with this huge culture, this rich and vast and vibrant culture that builds these huge, gigantic cities with like 80 million or 100 million people living in it, with this huge fucking monument of whatever type, either a civic building or a religious building or whatever, built directly in the center or somewhere on the outskirts in some kind of ceremonial place. I mean, you would have some serious questions about this, like, how far is this planet? Can we reach this in, let's say, 100 years? Is it possible for us to go there? Secondly, where did this culture come from? Where did I'm just going to say people, where did the people come from that built all this? I mean, you would have some serious questions. But Jesus, no. When it's revealed to him that there's an entirely new continent, and might I add, still largely uninhabited continent, there's not a people in the Americas at that time, save for everything south of the Rio Grande. No, that's, seen it, whatever. He doesn't, there's no, if we assume that this is actually literal history, there is no follow-up questions that he has. There is no, like, he never actually brings this up to anyone, to Peter or anyone, that he's like, hey, there's this gigantic, pretty much empty continent that we could technically go to if we're being persecuted in any way, or that you could technically go to if you're being persecuted in any way. Again, and to summarize all of this, it's just another way to show how, it's just another example of how inept the Bible is actually written, that the people who wrote this, if they really, like, it's just horrendous. It's the only way you can put this. It's just insane, and where you find that insanity, there's plenty more of it. So that was my take on this little scene in Matthew, and then again in Luke. Again, why have the same story twice if Matthew and Luke are technically chronological? Matthew came first, then came Luke at the very beginning, Mark, and at last. Last one is John. Good thing there are more interesting and more coherent books out there. Like, I don't know, the Popol Vuh, for example.